Let me welcome you. I'm Joellen Clary, representing JASNA Western Michigan region. And we're headed into week 7 discussions where Fanny goes to Portsmouth, returns to her childhood home. I want to note that next week we finish the rest of the novel. And anybody watching the pages thin as you get to the end, realizing how many loose ends there are, have to know how much will be happening next week. We have agreed to wrap it up on October 23rd, and some people who are traveling, like Wendy and Liz will be back for that conversation, and maybe a few others might want to join. And just for the record, on October 5 in Holland, Michigan, JASNA Michigan, West Michigan will be doing an in-person viewing of Patricia Rozema's controversial film about a controversial novel. They're controversial in different ways, as you can imagine. And if enough people Zooming can't make it to that and would like to talk about that a little later in October, that would be great. Okay, here we are. I did ask people if you have time, and you may not even have had time to take a look at the little screeds I sent. I'm not sure, I don't want to send them too early before people have been reading, but I should probably try to get them out a little earlier. So I don't know what you've had time to actually even register. But I suggested that everybody tonight try to read something aloud. I mentioned this specifically in regard to chapter 39, where Austin just takes us on a ride through Fanny's disappointed mind. And but still, really, I will rely on you just to jump in, say you'd really like to read something, whether it seems connected to what we're doing or not. So up front here, questions, irritations, comments generally, even about a kind of overview of what we read for today. Susan.
I did read both supplemental pieces that you sent out, and I was really taken by the person who described this as unromantic, unsentimental, and domestic realism. Now, having not read her other novels, but have seen the films, I'm thinking back on this, and it's like, they're all very calculating. Are they romantic? Not really. Are they they're not particularly sentimental. They don't really seem to care about what's happened or even their family. Like Thomas, the elder son, he kind of comes and goes. You don't really hear much about him, and yet he's the heir. So yeah, I thought that was a very interesting summation of the familial interaction.
Yeah, and in that same paragraph, I think I mentioned that Austen is really credited with, well, by Sir Walter Scott to start, as helping to create a modern novel that uses realism as opposed to romantic tricks of Gothic novels and high romance where everybody's deliriously happy at the end. I would like to say that realism isn't necessarily dark or tragic, but there will be moments. But you can bet your boots that if there's a romantic moment, really what we call Garden of Eden raptures, they're momentary. So it isn't necessarily tragedy, isn't necessarily comedy, but as Brian Southam goes on to say, one of Jane Austen's principles that, hi, Melissa. One of Jane Austen's principles is that she not write about what she doesn't know about. And we'll talk about a little bit more about that later, but thanks. I'm glad you mentioned that. Because what Scott calls domestic realism was a long time developing throughout the 19th century. The Victorians had all kinds of things that they pulled, their kind of late romanticism. So it's good to just have a little bit of a working sense of some of these terms as we move ahead. Anything else?
One of the things, by reading this so slowly, I am so annoyed at how much I want to like Henry Crawford. Because of the care he's really showing for her. You know, I know he's a schmuck. But
well, we don't know that yet.
Well, from what we saw back, the way he treated, you know, both Mariah and Julia.
Yeah.
than you know, and all the other girls who were throwing themselves at him. You know, just I think, wow, he could be a decent guy if only dot dot dot, you know, and it's annoying me because we keep stopping, and
Mhm.
I think, huh, but I know you can't trust him because of what he's done in the past.
Well, is that always fair?
No, it's not. But I just
No,
still think that he likes the chase more than the actual catching.
right, because she's not interested in him. If she had turned
The
around
challenge.
for him, he would have, yeah.
So Susan's a first-time reader, and I verified earlier has not read the ending of the novel. Is that true of you too, Colleen? How do you feel about this at this point, Henry Crawford? Because Jane Austen pulls out all the stops with Portsmouth, with Henry Crawford's visit to Portsmouth.
Oh yeah.
I don't know. I guess I feel a little bit conflicted. I don't want to like him though. Is it too short of
Rochester
an
was
answer?
pretty awful. Did Rochester change?
Oh, Mr. Rochester,
Rochester.
Yes, and Jane
don't
Eyre.
get me started. We'll be here all night. You'll go. I can't talk about that man. Yeah, I'll wait till I haven't read the ending yet, so I'll hold
Okay, okay, we'll
my
get
peace.
there. We'll get
I
there.
think back to when we first were introduced to Henry, and everybody said, "Oh, he's not particularly good looking. He's not really attractive. It's
Mhm.
only when he starts to talk and he kind of lays on this personality that their opinion of him changes."
Mhm.
So, and Fanny never liked him. She never saw the attraction. Her opinion never changed. She still found him unattractive.
Right.
But
Plain, yeah.
he's really pursuing
Mhm.
with great vigor at this point.
She has a little bit more of a disinterested eye, probably because of her position.
Mhm.
She was in her situation would not have allowed her to show attraction to Henry Crawford or anybody else, and she was probably seeing more clearly. And we have watched her grow, watching her act more, stand up for herself more, not be the little girl crying in the corner, not mention feeling like she's strong enough to mention that she'd like to write to her brother. We've got a fairly different Fanny now. But do you remember how she compares herself to Susan once she really starts watching Susan?
Oh, her sister.
Right. Let's see.
Well, she says Betsy's spoiled.
Yeah. It's in chapter 40.
Oh, okay.
Or chapter 9, and it's 367 mid in my Penguin. Let me see where that is. This is in chapter 40 after she's read Mary Crawford's News from the Outside World. She's really obsessed with what's happening with Mary Crawford and Edmund. And we're told on page 367, the first paragraph for me starts, "The first solid consolation which Fanny received for the evils," about the third page in.
Mhm.
See it?
Yes.
Okay, was in a better knowledge of Susan. Fanny always judges herself by being useful, right? She sees in Susan another way of being useful than she uses. And in that paragraph, about 5 or 6 lines up from the bottom, she realizes that Susan, with no outside education or training, has arrived at a kind of natural light of the mind, which could so early distinguish justly than to censure severely the faults of conduct to which it led. Susan was only acting on the same truths and pursuing the same system, which her own judgment acknowledged, but which Fanny's more supine and yielding temper would have shrunk from asserting. So there's a kind of lesson in remember, we've been talking kind of about other personalities, recognizing ways in which other people arrive at points, etc. So Fanny's still criticizing herself here, but she talks about shrinking, but to some extent, does that feel like something from the past, given how she appears in today's readings?
little bit like when she was first at Mansfield Park and she was taking a look at everybody around her to
Afraid of everyone.
check
Yeah.
them out. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is really an interesting section where Fanny meets Susan. Susan is a catalyst for Fanny making a little bit more of both of themselves. And how does she get there? Let's back up kind of to the beginning. Chapter 37 is a transitional chapter. The Crawfords have just left Mansfield, and it's while they're deciding whether Fanny will go to Portsmouth. What are Sir Thomas's and Fanny's expectations of her going to Portsmouth? What does he expect to accomplish?
He wants her to see how hard her life would be if she didn't marry Henry.
Yep.
That,
Yes.
Portsmouth is not the life that she's going to want. It's not the life she's used to. So he figures it'll tip her over the edge.
Mhm.
And Fanny's got this very romantic view of what her family will be like, how she's going to walk in and they're going to love her and welcome her. And everything's going to be great because it's great with William, but whoa, it's a shock because the rest of them are not like William.
Mhm. Her happiness was a quiet, deep, heart-swelling sort. And though never a great talker, she was always more inclined to silence when feeling most strongly. But then at the bottom of, let's see, this is in chapter 37, about 5 or 6 pages in, a long paragraph beginning, had Fanny been at all addicted to raptures?
Mhm.
Yep.
How many times have we talked about Fanny in rapture? A handful, maybe.
Yeah,
Very
not a few,
seldom,
very
usually
few,
about
yeah.
nature.
When, Jean?
Usually about nature.
Yes,
Yes.
in the shrubbery with Mary Crawford. Stargazing.
Yep.
Yep.
So we've seen her take,
Maybe horse riding.
yeah,
She really
yeah,
enjoyed the horse riding
yeah,
exercise.
getting out into nature.
Mhm.
So she wasn't addicted to raptures, but she was capable. Okay.
Mhm.
Then way down in that paragraph, about 6 or 7 lines up from the bottom, she's remembering her earliest pleasures, what she suffered in being torn from them, came over her with renewed strength. And it seemed as if to be home again would heal every pain that had since grown out of the separation. To be in the center of such a circle, loved by so many, feeling affection without fear or restraint, without Mrs. Norris, without her cousins looking down on her, etc. So she is in a kind of rapture about going back, right?
Mhm.
Except she's going to miss Edmund.
Yes,
Right.
yes, of course.
I
So-
was looking at a couple paragraphs prior to that when Sir Thomas is thinking about his own hopes and observation of Fanny's return to Portsmouth. His own observation still feeling a right by all his knowledge of human nature to expect to see the effect of the loss of power and consequence on his niece's spirits.
That's quite a statement, isn't it?
Mhm.
Yeah. And it's here, Colleen, 341 and 2/3, somewhere where we see the word scheme being used of Sir Thomas's plan. How is William a catalyst for that plan? We've
He's
talked
gonna-
about William as a necessary plot device several times.
Yeah.
He has to go back to his ship. Yeah, he has to board
Yep.
the ship, so he has to get back to Portsmouth.
So,
So
And
Fanny,
he can escort her on the trip.
yes.
yes.
And it'd be
Bruce
nice
will
for
get
him
back
to have
in.
her there before
Joe,
he,
Laura, I'm
it'd be
sorry.
nice for him to have her there
Yeah.
before he goes out.
Yeah, exactly. And in the next chapter, in 38, when we see them on the journey, William is delighted. He's thinking about his getting prize money now that he's and setting up a cottage for him and Fanny in the future. And he has expectations. We're not entirely sure what would happen with those. But there are a series of disappointments when Fanny gets there in chapter 38. What
Well,
do you remember in particular?
I do remember that Mrs. Norris said that she wanted to travel with them and they were horror struck by that idea.
That tempered
Number
initial
one, yeah.
joy, didn't it? Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Once she's there, though, we meet a whole new cast of characters at the time Fanny gets to gets to see her family again. And they've changed. It's been 10 years. The
Yeah.
baby then is 10 years old now, etc. Right?
The mom has died. Mary has died. Was it Mary that died? No.
Yes. Mary's the little
Yes.
girl who
Yeah.
died.
Well, I was told Joellen when before everybody joined how in this chapter we see how important letters are to Fanny, but yet we never heard about her corresponding with her family in Portsmouth, except for William. We never heard her say, "Oh, I'm writing to my mother to say this," and
Right.
she's writing back. Like there was very little contact
Mhm.
whatsoever between the two.
Yeah, we're not told at all. She writes to William when he's at sea. And yeah, how do servants appear in this chapter?
Oh,
We've talked
pretty-
about that before.
They're always incompetent.
Not well managed.
And her mother's obsessed with them, right?
Oh yeah, can't get good
Makes
ones.
everything on them.
You can't
Yeah.
get good servants in Portsmouth. They're just not available.
Fanny makes some gender distinctions between the males in the family and the females in the family and how they annoy her, how they make noise.
Mhm.
What about the young boys and her father?
Oh, when the first arrival of the father, she was very dismayed at his language, his comportment, the way he basically ignored her, didn't even see her.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And then he'd yell, right?
Mhm. They're
The
very,
little boys are tearing around. What about the women, though, when all of the males are gone?
Well, Betsy and Susan are fighting because Betsy's incredibly spoiled
Yeah.
by the mother who doesn't have a clue how to be a parent.
Oh, that's the passage that I was going to read aloud
Please do.
about the two sisters and
Okay.
Fanny's reaction to them.
Okay. Where are we?
We're in chapter 39,
Okay.
paragraph 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I believe it is.
How does it start? Oh,
It says, of her two sisters,
Yeah.
Mrs. Price very much more resembled Lady Bertram than Mrs. Norris. She was a manager by necessity, without of any Mrs. Norris's inclination for it or any of her activity. Her disposition was naturally easy and indolent, shades of the other of Lady Bertram. Like Lady Bertram's, and a situation of similar affluence and do-nothingness would have been much more suited to her capacity than the exertions and self-denials of the one which her imprudent marriage has placed her in. Might she have made just as a good woman of consequence as Lady Bertram? But Mrs. Norris would have been a much more respectable mother of 9 children on a small income.
Did that surprise you, hearing something positive maybe about Mrs. Norris?
It really was quite an eye-opener.
Yeah, potentialities.
Mhm.
And when they're all sitting down together, Fanny, her mother, Betsy, Susan, that's when the knife comes up, which we've
Oh,
alluded
yes, the little silver knife.
to. And the mother's going on about servants, and they drive her crazy in a different way. So it's on page 359 toward the bottom that Fanny kind of sums up how she was fatigued and fatigued again. That's last page, second paragraph from the end.
Which chapter is that?
What we're at 38.
38?
Yeah. Fanny
Oh,
fatigued
yes, I see. Fatigued again, yes.
was thankful to accept the first invitation of going to bed. And before Betsy had finished her cry at being allowed to sit up only 1 hour extraordinary in honor of her sister, she was off, leaving all below in confusion and noise again. The boys begging for toasted cheese, her father calling out for his rum and water, and Rebecca never where she ought to be. And in the last paragraph, we hear about the room where she's
yes.
going up to.
Well, we saw that initially when she stepped into what would be the parlor, and she thought that was just like the anteroom
Yes.
leading to
Yeah.
something else, but that was it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The
Mhm.
10 years have changed her a lot too. Okay, I got rapturous describing chapter 39. It's really tucked in here. We could possibly do without this chapter because we're told of Fanny's disappointments, but she just really takes us down the road of Fanny.
Hello?
All well?
Yeah.
Megan disappeared. I hope she's all right. Anyway, basically depicts, deepens Fanny's thwarted expectations. Examples of repetitions, word choices that enact, as I wrote, the factualities or actualities of Portsmouth, as Fanny expresses it. Did you light upon any sections of this to read for us? At least, can you point us to some of the repetitions? Did you notice them?
Quite a bit about evil in here.
Like the repeated information that Mrs. Price wasn't a great homemaker, is that?
Actually, okay, yeah,
They
that's
drill down deeper into that, which is really interesting when you think about what you said, Joellen, about chapter 38 and the servants, and it's kind of like, okay. And not to bring everything back to the Brontes, but I will say that's a really big difference between the Brontes. I mean, for Charlotte Bronte and Emily Bronte, the servants are integral to this story. I mean, Wuthering Heights, one of the servants is a narrator, and Jane Eyre, one of the servants, is like a key character.
Yeah.
So it's really jarring for me, coming from that background, to look at the way that servants are discussed in this
Mhm.
work, and so dismissively, even juxtaposed with this knowledge that, like, actually Mrs. Price needed she sounds like she needed a lot of help, and who was she to kind of poo-poo like the quality? It wasn't living up to her standards.
Mhm.
It's
Well,
very
it sounds,
strange.
Yeah.
she
And-
obviously grew up in a family that had servants, so she'd seen them being managed, hopefully by her
Yeah.
mother, but that obviously didn't rub off.
Yeah.
She was pretty clueless.
Yeah, we've noted before that servants appear more in this novel than in any other of Jane Austen's novels. Partly that has to do with a bigger movement toward realism. Remember, Northanger Abbey, Sense and Sensibility, and Pride and Prejudice were all written in the 1790s. She didn't get around to revising Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice for publication until she was in Chawton, and I think maybe it was at 1809 or something like that, when they had a stable home again. And after that, the first novel she wrote out of whole cloth was Mansfield Park. And there's been a kind of sea change, which we're noting as we go along here. And we can talk sometime about Fanny and servants, maybe. She's kind of an in-between class. But please look at the second paragraph in chapter 39 or 8. Before the weekend ended, it was all disappointment. Then she lists, William was gone, the thrush had its orders, etc., etc. There had been no free conversation, no walk in the ramparts, no visit to the dockyard, no acquaintance with the thrush, nothing of all they had planned and depended on. Everything in that quarter failed her, except William's affection. No, nothing. That happens again in this chapter, exactly that. Turn a couple pages.
Even though William charges his mother to take care of Fanny, she is not used to rough like the rest of us.
There's a kind of, you might be slightly horrified. We're in Fanny's mind. This is Fid, the narrator blending with inside Fanny's mind. We're not sure who's choosing the words, but on about the third page, paragraph beginning, much of all of this. Okay, see it? Attention is drawn to that. Much of all this, Fanny could not but be sensible of. She might scruple to make use of the words, meaning she might not use the words, but she must and did feel that her mother was a partial, ill-judging parent, a dawdle, a slattern. Somebody mentioned that feeling before, but a slattern?
That's pretty rough.
Mother, a slattern, who neither taught nor restrained her children, whose house was the scene of mismanagement and discomfort from beginning to end, and who had no talent, no conversation, no affection towards herself, no curiosity to know her better, no desire of her friendship, and no inclination for her company that could lessen her sense of such feelings. Now, I kind of ruined it by making such emphases, but they just pile up, don't they? No, nothing, no. So Austen is giving us the depth of feeling here, using some language that Fanny might not have used, but how she likely felt. She was deeply disappointed.
Well, and you see it even in the third paragraph.
Okay, starts William was gone.
William was gone, and the home he had left her in was, Fanny could not conceal it from herself, in almost every respect, the very reverse of what she could have wished. It was the abode of noise, disorder, impropriety. Nobody was in the right place. Nothing was done as it ought to be. She could not respect her parents as she had hoped. On her father, her confidence had not been sanguine, but he was more negligent of the family. His habits were worse and his manners coarser than she had been prepared for. He did not want abilities, but he had no curiosity, no information
Mhm.
beyond his profession. He read only the newspaper and the Navy list. He talked only of the dockyard, the harbor, and so on. And then the next paragraph is about her mother. Her disappointment in her mother was greater. There she had hoped much and found almost nothing. Every flattering scheme of being a consequence to her soon fell to the ground. Mrs. Price was not unkind, but instead was gaining on her affection and confidence and becoming more and more dear. Her daughter never met with greater kindness from her than on the first day of her arrival. The instinct of nature was soon satisfied, and Mrs. Price's attachment had no other source. Her heart and her time were already quite full. She had neither leisure nor affection to bestow on Fanny. So it's the whole chapter is
Yeah,
just
yeah, this, as I said, possibly we could do without this chapter, but we'd lose a lot. I mean, in
Oh,
terms
yeah.
of information. And it also sets up the next chapter. What is the one saving grace in this chapter that makes it evident to us, but perhaps also to Fanny, that something, she might make it through this, something might come out of this?
The change in her relationship with Susan?
Not yet.
Not
She
yet? Okay,
isn't
that's
going
further
to
along. Okay.
Susan here. Who is it though? Page 362 in the Penguin. Paragraph ahead of it. Fanny was very anxious to be useful and not to appear above her home.
Oh, little Sam?
Yep. Sam, loud and overbearing as he was, she rather regretted when he went. He went off on the thrush as well.
Yeah,
For
oh,
he
that's
was
right.
clever
Yeah.
and intelligent and glad to be employed in any errand in the town. And though spurning the remonstrances of Susan, given as they were, though very reasonable in themselves, with ill-timed and powerless warmth, was beginning to be influenced by Fanny's services and gentle persuasions. So that's how Fanny has defined herself, isn't it?
Mhm.
Being useful.
Etc. And Sam sheds a little bit of daylight on that. Let's move right along to chapter 40. Where the first letter is introduced. Believe me, we'll talk more about the importance of letters in next week's readings. But think about the only way that Fanny would have any contact at all with the set that she says where her heart lived. The people she's been most interested in, the people she's known for 10 years, would almost only be through letters, right?
Mhm.
Mhm.
So this is Mary's first. We get two from Mary in this chapter. What can you tell us about, remind us about this letter?
It's really long.
Get ready for others coming later. What does she talk about?
She saw the Rushworths,
Yeah.
Julia, and as well.
Yeah, she reports on all of the cousins, including Edmund, who's not there, as well as her brother, right?
Mhm.
Henry's in Norfolk. And in the next chapter, where is he?
Well, he shows up in Portsmouth.
Yes, so we're not expecting him, are we? But this is also the chapter where Susan, after she's really worried, she thinks that we're told it's kind of like, remember we talked briefly once about Darcy's letter to Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice, where the whole chapter is a letter in that case.
Mhm.
The next chapter, Elizabeth Bennet goes through the whole letter again, slows it down, reads it carefully, Austen teaches her readers how we should be reading, and she's weighing and balancing, noting that her first responses weren't necessarily accurate, and she has quite a different sense of it. In a way, Fanny does the same thing. 366 bottom is the bottom of my second page. There was great food for meditation in this letter, and chiefly for unpleasant meditation. Yet with all the uneasiness it supplied, it connected her with the absent. It told her of people and things about whom she had never felt so much curiosity. Her correspondence with her Aunt Bertram was her only concern of higher interest. She does get a letter, we're told, very briefly, from Aunt Bertram later. Remember what information she sends? Who's the only person who could have told her? Edmund
Edmund,
is in London.
London.
Yep. So Fanny knows this before she ever hears anything, any kind of report. But basically, then on the next page, the first solid consolation, we're told, which Fanny received for the evils of home, was a better knowledge of Susan. What does that better knowledge consist of? Skim down that long paragraph.
That a girl of 14,
Mm-hmm.
acting only on her own unassisted reason, should err in the method of reform was not wonderful, and Fanny soon became more disposed to admire the natural light of the mind, which could so early distinguish justly than to censure severely the faults of the conduct to which it led. So
Yeah.
she's impressed that she could identify that there are things to be corrected, but she's not really good in her manner of trying to make corrections. But at 14, to notice this isn't the way things should be is pretty.
And it's amazing that Susan knows something's wrong at home, or even knows what's wrong at home. And that knowledge opens the door to Fanny, who again feeling she might have some use, right?
Yes.
That she might be of service. But she, toward the bottom of that paragraph, Susan tried to be useful where she could only have gone away and cried, where Fanny would have only gone away and cried. And that Susan was useful. She could perceive that things, bad as they were, would have been worse, but for such interposition, and that both her mother and Betsy were restrained from some excesses of very offensive indulgence and vulgarity. In every argument with her mother, Susan had in point of reason the advantage, and never was there any maternal tenderness to buy her off. So early on, Fanny's quite shocked by Susan's forthright behavior to their mother, right? Here she's beginning to recognize that it actually plays a role a little bit more.
And Mom just keeps on doing her thing. Yeah.
And what does this allow Fanny to do? How does she become useful?
Well, she commiserates with Susan and tends to try to help her move through these things and maybe help make improvements.
Okay, how?
Well, she listens to her. She gives her a little bit of advice. Yeah.
Right.
And she resolves this issue of the silver pen or knife or whatever it is, yeah.
Right.
By purchasing a second one so that they can quit bickering over it.
Yeah. And she has the means to do that for the first time.
Yeah.
Yeah, she has 10. That's a lot of money back then.
10 pounds under her control.
Yeah, a lot of money.
So she could buy this little silver light.
Melissa.
Thank you. I think it's interesting to think about this being a repetition of Mrs. Norris wanting to take Fanny in in a similar way, like to better Fanny. And here we have Fanny looking at her sister in the same way Mrs. Norris was looking at Fanny. And so I think there's something to think about with how perceptions have changed. Like when the Bertrams want to take Fanny and they assumed that she would be, her behavior would be horrible and she wouldn't understand the class structure. And I think Fanny is just as surprised by Susan's behavior as the Bertrams were by Fanny's behavior. Because I think this novel has a ton of like these repeating character patterns that are just overlaying each other. like right now we're kind of thinking while we read this, or I was anyways, like, which of the sisters is Fanny going to be? Is she going to be like Mrs. Norris? Is she going to be like Mrs. Bertram? Is she going to be like her mother? Like, it seems like there's these three paths she could go down. And she's exploring that, I think, in these chapters. Like, if I become my mother, this could be my life in Portsmouth. If I marry the wrong person, I could end up with this horrible life, no matter who that person might be. I think that's all I wanted to say about that.
No, you're absolutely right. And we want to be really aware of repeated patterns as we go along here. We're at the end now. And in fact, Edmund's relation to Fanny as the kind of guide and having anything, Fanny says, knew as anything like an office of authority was to Fanny, knew as it was to imagine herself capable of guiding or informing anyone, she did resolve on giving hints, which is what Edmund did with her, which includes also
The lending library.
the lending library reading. That's mostly what we know about the relationship between Edmund and Fanny, isn't it?
Yep.
The importance of books, the importance of reading. And would anybody like to read just a little bit about in Fanny's mind? It's like the second paragraph from the end, probably, or anything you see. And Melissa, here's another repetition. I think second paragraph from the end is really long. The intimacy thus begun between them. They were sitting upstairs without a fire, but that is a privation that was familiar to Fanny.
Yeah.
So there's a kind of repetition even there. But does Fanny go into raptures about her new role?
Okay, where are we here? Which chapter?
I'm on the very last page. Chapter 40 or 9. Yeah.
Okay.
Toward the bottom of the second paragraph from the end, 370 in my pen.
Influence?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, got it.
Some of her funds found a way to a circulating library. She became a subscriber, amazed at being anything in propria persona, amazed at her own doings in every way, to be a renter, a chooser of books, and to be having anyone's improvement in view in her choice. But so it was. Susan had read nothing, and Fanny longed to give her a share of her own first pleasures and inspire a taste for the biography and poetry which she delighted in herself.
And then last
we talked a little bit about mixed motives, the beginning of the next paragraph. In this occupation, she hoped, moreover, to bury some of the recollections of Mansfield, which were too apt to seize her mind if her fingers only were busy, and especially at this time hoped it might be useful in diverting her thoughts from pursuing Edmund to London. How could she pursue Edmund to London?
She
Thoughts, right?
Imagination, yeah.
Yeah. We're told
she had the
postman's
money.
knock at the door every day gives her terror. Anything else in this paragraph that you noticed that you'd like to draw to our attention? Then let's move to Henry Crawford's appearance in Portsmouth. We know that Fanny responds with utter dread initially, but he's kind, right? He turns his eyes away and gives her a little time to adjust, etc., etc. And how does he treat her parents, for example? Can you find sections?
Very respectfully.
Yeah, yes, very much so.
He's trying hard, isn't he?
He devoted himself entirely to her mother, addressing her and attending to her with the utmost politeness and propriety.
I think Fanny's like dreading seeing him, but that's balanced by this like, oh yay, there's so much better from Mansfield Park.
Yes.
Reprieve, yes.
The personal visit makes his the only other source of news from Mary's letter so far.
She's kind of soaking that in, I think, as much as she doesn't want to, decide to marry him, she also wants to kind of enjoy the time, I think, with him. Just to soak up some Mansfield Park aura.
Yeah, and she throws a little light on, or Henry Crawford's interaction with her parents throws a little bit more light on them. We're told her father had abilities. So far we haven't seen much evidence of that, but
Do we
even
know what he
here,
does?
well, he was a lieutenant in the
In the Marines.
wasn't much. They were rather scorned at the time. And he never got past being a lieutenant, and he was invalided, but we'll get there. But back where Susan was reading, it's on third page, wait, oh man, several pages in my book in this chapter, right dead center. A paragraph beginning, Mrs. Price's manners were also at their best. That
Yes.
he was friendly and polite, warmed by the sight of such a friend to her son, and regulated by the wish of appearing to advantage before him. She was overflowing with gratitude, artless maternal gratitude, which could not be unpleasing. Fanny was relieved that her father was out, but when Henry Crawford suggests that they're not getting enough exercise and gets the daughters out for a walk, who do they run into but?
Oh, but Dad.
Other.
It's 374 in the Penguin. Find the paragraph beginning, Mr. Crawford probably could not regard.
Yep.
Anybody want to read a section from that?
Okay, Mr. Crawford probably could not regard his future father-in-law with any idea of taking him for a model in dress. But as Fanny instantly, and to her great relief, discerned, her father was a very different man, a very different Mr. Price in his behavior to this most highly respected stranger. Dad stepped up to the plate.
Yeah, and he doesn't show any of these manners at home. But he says they weren't polished, were more than passable. They were grateful, animated, manly. His expressions were those of an attached father and a sensible man. He's showing himself, and they know who Mr. Crawford is, right, in relation to their son.
Right.
So that paragraph ends. There was not a single oath to be heard. Such was his instinctive compliment to the good manners of Mr. Crawford, and be the consequence what it might, Fanny's immediate feelings were infinitely soothed.
You know, having been a lieutenant in the Marines, he would have had encounters with officers and had the opportunity to be in their company and probably dined in officers' messes and this sort of thing. So he had to have a modicum of politeness about him.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, the Navy is extremely hierarchical. And even though the Marines were seen as a necessary evil, they were Army. They weren't part of the Navy. And they probably messed together, but they were on board ship. And yes, they did take orders, et cetera, et cetera. And at the end, Crawford earns Fanny's undying respect because he rejects taking his mutton with the family.
Yes.
And in the last sentence of the chapter, there are two italicized words. She was nice only from natural delicacy, but he had been brought up in a school of luxury and epicurism. Okay, in the next chapter, though, we get close to raptures. Where do we visit?
Well, we go to church.
Go to church, and then
We go for a walk.
The ramparts.
Yeah. Okay, this is where Austen makes it hard, is really tempting us to, and tempting Fanny to like Mr. Crawford. Examples?
They're both enjoying the beauty of the scene.
Yes.
And Mrs. Price has upped her game. She's got her best dress on and is behaving herself and, you know, looking good.
And Lady Bertram is right. They're a very handsome family, right?
Yes.
And walking on the ramparts is once weekly. It's Mrs. Price's holiday for the week. It was her public place, and thither they now went, page 380. Fanny doesn't quite understand how Crawford is between her and Susan, each taking an arm. And then in the next paragraph, we get really rare open air description by Austen. And this is evoked by the natural settings and natural raptures that we've seen Fanny experiencing before.
Mhm.
Would you choose to read little bits of it?
The loveliness of the day and of the view he felt like herself. They often stopped with the same sentiment and taste, leaning against the wall some minutes to look and admire. And considering he was not Edmund, Fanny could not but allow that he was sufficiently open to the charms of nature and very well able to express his admiration. She had a few tender reveries now and then, which he could sometimes take advantage of to look in her face without detection. And the result of these looks was that though as bewitching as ever, her face was less blooming than it ought to be. So he's noticing that she's really not
Mhm.
thriving.
Yeah, she said she was very well.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
she's not.
And we're told later in the paragraph that if he actually saw what she ate at home, etc., he would
was
have
very
been
concerned.
even more
Yeah.
horrified. But that's when he has the idea to offer a ride back to Mansfield
Yes.
with him and Mary in his carriage. Go to the paragraph just above what Laura just read, which is second page for me. And this paragraph begins, "The day was uncommonly lovely." Okay.
Yes.
Brian Southam points out, and I mentioned this in the supplement, that Jane Austen doesn't give us much spectacle. And his examples are the waves billowing, the martial music playing, and all of this rambunctious spectacle. But what we hear about here is about the mild air, brisk, soft wind, and bright sun, occasionally clouded for a minute, and everything looks so beautiful under the influence of such a sky. The effects of the shadows pursuing each other on the ships at Spithead and the islands beyond, with the ever-varying hues of the sea, now at high water, dancing in its glee and dashing against the ramparts with so fine a sound, produce altogether such a combination of charms for Fanny as made her gradually almost careless of the circumstances under which she felt them. She no longer had herself on quite such a leash.
So
And-
I'm sorry, remind me,
Oh, go ahead.
did Austen live in Portsmouth for a while?
That's another point that I was going to bring up earlier, but we can't bring up everything. But Portsmouth was, of course, Jane Austen had two brothers in the Navy. So she wrote from a sister's point of view. When she was selecting, she never takes us to sea. She hears about William's exploits, as I mentioned, in the parlor.
Mhm.
We never follow to sea in the same way that Austen advised her niece not to visit Ireland with her characters if she's never been there. And Austen shares with us what she knows on the land and what she knows she has learned from her brothers at sea. So Portsmouth, yes, she definitely would have been there. And she lived in neighboring Southampton during a
Okay,
period
yeah.
after her father died. And she, her sister, and mother were really batted around among relatives until, as we mentioned, in 1809, the wealthy brother set them up in Chawton, where she started publishing.
So when she's in Portsmouth, it's during the Napoleonic Wars.
Oh, yes, her whole life.
So it's bustling. It's
The
full
whole
of
life,
soldiers.
the
Yes.
Napoleonic Wars were going on. Yes, yes. Austen does not take that on as her main theme, in part because her realism, her attempts in her art are to be leashed to what she knows. But that doesn't mean there's not a subtle undercurrent, that our attention isn't given to the fact that Sir Thomas owns a plantation in Antigua, that he clearly has opinions on the slave trade. We talked a little bit about the dates that could get involved there. And it's no surprise that, in fact, in Patricia Rozema's film, that the date it's set is 1806, before the British law forbidding the slave trade across oceans. And then there were a series of laws coming after that. Most scholars don't place it quite as early, but really more in Austen's lifetime. In this chapter, we're also told that she manages to place a juster value on Henry, and she's in low spirits when she parts with him because he was something in the nature of a friend.
Right.
Okay. Now, let's go to the last paragraph of this chapter. Anybody want to read from there?
Chapter 40, 41, where are we here?
Chapter 40 or 9? Oh, 42, I'm sorry. End of 42 or 9. Last paragraph.
Oh, her dejection had
Yes.
no abatement from anything passing around her.
Mm-hmm. Skim down it.
She was very low.
Mm-hmm.
The wonderful improvement which she still fancied in Mr. Crawford was the nearest to administering comfort of anything within the current of her thoughts.
Someone pick it up. Not considering.
Okay, now not considering in how different a circle she had been just seeing him, nor how much might be owing to contrast, she was quite persuaded of his being astonishingly more gentle and regardful of others than formerly. And if little things must not be so, and if in little things must not be so great, so anxious for her health and comfort, so feeling as he now expressed himself, and really seemed, might it not be fairly supposed that he would not much longer persevere in a suit so distressing to her.
Has Austin pulled the rug out from under us in that last
Yeah,
sentence?
yeah. Okay, maybe he's not such a bad guy after all. No,
Yeah.
she's saying maybe he'll stop bothering me.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
one
but
to the other, yes.
she thinks and feels those things, but what her hope for what will come out of it is that he'll recognize how distressed he makes her and leave her alone. Let's look at our
I don't think
last
I ever
chapter.
noticed that. All the times I've read it before, I don't think I noticed that.
We
Like I said,
slow
we're
down.
reading
and
it so slowly. Yeah,
Yep.
Yeah.
We slow down and we see all kinds
it
of
really
things.
jumped out at me.
Okay, chapter 43. Nearly half of it is another letter from Mary. What does Fanny learn from it, and why does it upset her?
Oh, Mary still, she's getting more soft-hearted toward Edmund. Fanny's
Okay.
concerned.
Okay.
I thought it was funny just how it started out. I
Yeah.
have to inform you, my dearest Fanny, that Henry is bound down to Portsmouth to see you. They did a delightful walk with you into the dockyard. All these different things that I have to tell you that he did this.
And the detail that he gave her when the balmy air, the sparkling sea, and your sweet looks and conversation were all together in the most delicious harmony and afforded sensations which are to raise ecstasy, even in retrospect. So Henry Crawford reported on that beautiful day as well. And she talks about Susan in the next paragraph.
Yeah.
But she says that she really has no news. Fanny can read politics in the newspaper. A third source of information from the outside world is available to Fanny, but she wouldn't expect to read anything about Mansfield there, right? She talks about Edmund being in London at a
Yep.
party.
Yes.
What does she have to say? What's important there? End of that paragraph, just before yours affectionately.
And I must confess, when he dined here the other day, there were none to compare with him. And we were a party of 16.
Yeah, Mrs. Fraser thought he was quite something.
Right, right.
But luckily, there's no distinction of dress nowadays to tell tales. So she still is upset with them for being a minister instead of
Mm-hmm,
more important
mm-hmm.
in her eyes.
Then she goes on bringing up the rescue plan that Henry has suggested to Fanny about getting her out of Portsmouth, and that they could even do a little tour. They could take her to London. She could see St. George's, and they could go by Everingham, etc. So she's attempting to get her out. Again, top of page 387 in the Penguin, third page in my text. This was a letter to be run through eagerly. So like Elizabeth Bennet in that chapter following Darcy's letter, as Fanny did herself following Mary's first letter in this section, to be read deliberately to supply matter for much reflection. The only certainty drawn from it, the only positive thing, is that nothing decisive has yet taken place.
Yes.
Right. But What else does she think about Mary in this musing?
She doesn't know what she would do when Edward does speak. She doesn't know.
Mhm.
Would she accept him or not? She's still too prejudiced against it.
Fanny thinks she would hesitate, she would tease, she would condition, she would require a great deal, but she would finally accept. And this is one thing that she's stewing about.
Mhm.
And she dismisses the information that Mr. Crawford might go to Norfolk. Remember, he has asked for her advice about that earlier.
Mhm.
Before or after the 14th was certainly no concern of hers, though everything considered, she thought he would go without delay. That Miss Crawford should endeavor to secure a meeting between him and Mrs. Rushworth was all in her worst line of conduct and grossly unkind, but she hoped he would not be actuated by any such degrading of curiosity. And she has a higher opinion of him now and thinks his sister ought to give him credit for having better feelings than her own. And we're told in the next paragraph, she's really impatient for another letter. She doesn't get a letter in the next 3 or 4 days. So finally, she dives back in with Susan again hoping to set her mind at rest about what the letter that she might be getting from Edmund and what the news will be. But here we learn more about Susan. Take a quick look at the last 3 paragraphs in
Well,
this.
Susan did not have the early habit of reading.
Uh-huh.
The early habit of reading was wanting, so she wasn't accustomed to reading a book or poetry or anything the way Fanny had been once she.
Right. And
was moved
so
to
she's really
Mansfield Park.
motivated by not wanting to appear ignorant, a
Mhm.
word that's italicized. She preferred Fanny's style to Goldsmith's, etc. She's really a partial sister. But she wants to talk to Fanny mostly about Mansfield, right? Leading to the last paragraph. That's another important last paragraph.
Oh, about poor Susan being
Yep.
was very little better fitted for home than her elder sister.
Yeah. And Fanny would love to do something for Susan, but what could she do? What crosses her mind?
She doesn't want to leave Susan behind.
If she
No.
could bring
If
herself
she-
Mary Crawford, she could help Susan a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Were she likely to have a home to invite her to, what a blessing it would be. And had it been possible for her to return Mr. Crawford's regard, the probability of his being very far from objecting to such a measure would have been the greatest increase of all her own comforts. She thought he really was good-tempered and could fancy his entering into a plan of that sort most pleasantly.
So he could help save Fanny and her sister,
Mhm.
basically. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, we have been set up before. Very quickly, it's 8:01, but I brought up chapter 34 again for just this reason. We have other times when we could see Henry Crawford's effect on Fanny. And if you look back to page 30 or chapter 34, or what is it? 3, volume 3, chapter 3. We have that section where Henry Crawford begins reading. She's observed by Edmund and Henry himself, but observed by Edmund while Henry Crawford is reading. And it's about 4 or 5 pages in when Crawford took the volume.
Mm-hmm.
Later in that middle of that, about a third of the way into that paragraph, she's trying not to look at him. All her attention was for her work. She seemed determined to be interested by nothing else, but taste was too strong in her. She could not abstract her mind 5 minutes. She was forced to listen. His reading was capital and her pleasure in good reading extreme. And we're told that she's been raised with good readers in the household, that she's been taught to appreciate it, and his reading, like his acting, was expressed with beauty, truly dramatic. His acting had first taught Fanny what pleasure a play might give, and his reading brought all his acting before her again. nay, perhaps with greater enjoyment, for it came unexpectedly, with no such drawback as she had been used to suffer in seeing him on the stage with Maria Burton. Okay, Edmund watched the progress. What does he notice? Skim that paragraph. 312 in the Penguin. Specifics. What does Edmund notice watching Fanny?
How she appeared to fix her eyes on Crawford for
That's-
minutes
Yep.
and
Look
then
above
closed.
that.
And
Oh, go ahead.
the charm was broken and she was again shrinking into herself.
Yeah, before that, okay, go to the top of that paragraph again.
Oh, she was
Edmund was
quite
gratified
enraptured. Yes.
by seeing how she gradually slackened the needlework, which at the beginning seemed to occupy her totally, how it fell from her hand while she sat motionless over it. And at last, how her eyes, which had appeared so studiously to avoid him throughout the day, were turned and fixed on Crawford, fixed on him for minutes, fixed on him in short, until the charm is broken. There are bodily responses, right? She's charmed, she's drawn, physically, aesthetically. And we see once again what Crawford saw in her when she was with William, that she was capable of affection, that she was capable of responding, capable of raptures. But what do both, and Crawford tries to take advantage of that then, trying to, talk to her again because he's noticed this response. What do they both miss though? She's temporarily flummoxed. She can't even answer or begin to think about Crawford's first question to her. It's not said directly, I don't think, but she can recover herself. She can go into a rapture. But unlike, say, Maria Burton, she can come out of it. That she has some kind of control, despite the fact that she's a little dizzy after the reading. She comes back to the situation, even if she's temporarily flummoxed. Toward the end here, I think there's an if only, a qualification.
Well, she says, perhaps, sir, said Fanny, wearied at last into speaking. Perhaps, sir, I thought it was a pity you did not know yourself as well as you seemed to do at that moment.
Not for a constancy, yes. And Crawford, delighted to have her speak, more or less accepts it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's another
determined to keep it up. Yep.
Yeah, and that's the second, about the second or third page in from the end of the paragraph. After what Jean just read, perhaps, sir, the next paragraph begins, Crawford delighted. Go down 6 or 7 lines, and we have some more verbal pyrotechnics. He had always something to entreat the explanation of. The opportunity was too fair. None such had occurred since his seeing her in her uncle's room. None such might occur again before his leaving Mansfield. So those repetitions draw us along with where his mind's going and emphasizes points. So remember in last week's readings, I mentioned this was the anomaly. Every other chapter was Fanny being badgered by somebody, interviewed by Edmund, by Sir Thomas, by Crawford himself, and even Mary Crawford. But this sets up something that's, again, to be drawn on later, that Fanny is capable of response, and plenty of people at the end of this section, especially when they're reading it quickly through, don't really notice a lot of the only ifs, the if I had been ables that we notice here. So that's where the situation is left as we go into our last week of readings, right?
Yes.
Any other comments to share just bits that you'd like to read or just, that we
Okay,
didn't-
Lady Bertram, you know,
Oh,
how
yes.
much I love her. Well,
Watch
this was,
watch out for her next time. We had
Okay, so-
virtually no Lady Bertram this time.
so this was in that same chapter after Crawford gets through reading and they're talking about Fanny and nothing has
Oh, yeah,
occurred
in
since
34.
before. Yeah. Lady Bertram's being just on the other side of the table was a trifle, where she might always be considered to be only half awake. Just the indolence of the woman just astonishes me. So yeah.
Lady Bertram is one of the major threads pulling Susan through this book and the rest of us. Thanks, thanks. Yeah, Lady Bertram sightings are always welcome. Okay, so if you haven't read the ending before, you really might want to kind of even zip through and then try to go back through it as we're ending things. If you don't have time to do that and just read carefully, that's great. And the last, I will note though, for all of us, the last chapter is the most discussed conclusion of any Austen novel. And it's also one inspiration for Patricia Rozema's film, setting up some of her thinking. But Austen disposes of everyone quickly. So we go through information, there are explosions, but read more or less as we've been reading until that last chapter. Well, Colleen, I hope you can make it. But yes, read the ending and send a note about what you think.
Yeah, let us know what you think.
Yeah,
Okay.
and we'll be
Yes,
talking.
please do.
Is everyone able to make the next week, the 23rd? Oh,
Yes.
yeah. Liz Keegan and is it Keegan? Anyway, Liz and Wendy will be back in town and they'll definitely be here. And maybe for the one of the next two sessions or two, we'll pick up a few people who've read it before who'd like to talk about the ending. But
Okay.
listen, I can't thank you enough
Thank you.
no,
Thank you.
giving me the
Yeah.
opportunity to go through this again at such a slow pace. And it's really been eye-opening to me. I've read it before, but you know, pretty casually, and still, you know, came away. I don't think a lot of my opinions have been shifted very much, but we can see how Austen is just so adept at handling these characters. Do we have any flat characters?
Not really, no.
Even little boys are always running through, making noise and, causing trouble.
Yeah, they're probably flattish. But even remember Lady Bertram? We talked about being on the bubble at one point. Pay attention to Lady Bertram in this last section. Things affect her too. Okay, great to see you. I'm sorry we're running
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Well, you too. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.